I see trees of green, red roses deep. I see them blue from me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blues and clouds of white, the bright blessed day and dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking up, saying, how do you do? And they really say, I love you. I hear baby cry, I'll watch them grow, and they learn much more than I ever know. And I think to myself, oh, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky,